Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, hell on earth, one of the deadliest days for Palestinians in Israel's war on Gaza.
Israel is facing international condemnation after airstrikes killed at least 45 people sheltering in tents near a UN building in southern Gaza on Sunday.
The attack follows last week's International Court of Justice ruling ordering Israel to stop its offensive in Rafah. So what now? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. This is the moment an Israeli airstrike hit a Palestinian refugee camp in Rafah. A fire tore through tents, burning people alive, in an area that Israel had designated a safe zone.
The bomb fell, the streets were filled with fire, and everything burned.
It was just days after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to stop its assault in Rafah.
The Israeli occupation forces targeted internally displaced people camp.
Akram al-Satari is a freelance journalist in Khan Yunis, to the north of Rafah, where he's been watching this unfold.
That targeting resulted in the killing of dozens of Palestinians and the injury of around 249 Palestinians, according to the reports issued by the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Among those who were killed, children, women, and elderly people.
We were sitting in tents when suddenly the camp was bombed. I lost 5 family members, all burned completely. Among the victims were pregnant women. They kept telling us this area was safe until we're bombed.
And that bombardment resulted in a fire that was started in the internally displaced people camp.
The people killed in the camp had been told by Israel they would be safe there, despite the ongoing attacks.
The Palestinian Red Crescent says people were burned alive in their tents. The injured are being treated in overwhelmed and under-equipped hospitals.
That fire killed several Palestinians, while the shrapnel resulting from the bombardment also caused severe amputations among the people who were injured.
These are witnesses from that night.
There was nothing unusual. Then we heard a very loud noise, and fire erupted around us. All the children started screaming, and all the nearby rooms were shaking. The sound was terrifying.
Missiles came crashing down on an entire block, and people were burned.
Throughout the night, very large number of people were taken to different hospitals and field hospitals, including hospitals that are run by international NGOs and hospitals that are run by local NGOs.
Once again, Palestinians seeking refuge in Gaza have found that there is none.
Palestinians are shocked and disheartened because of that incident, and they believe that there is no safe place in Gaza. There is no one safe in the Gaza Strip.
The camp is known to be for the displaced. Most of the people who come here are from the north. The camp was on fire.
And this refugee camp is one of several areas hit recently as Israel ramps up its attacks on Rafah, Akram told us.
Rafah city has been seeing a great deal of escalation because of the ongoing ground operation in the city, targeting the eastern parts of the city, southern and northern parts also, with the Israeli occupation forces pushing deeper inside the central Rafah. The number of people who are killed is increasing, and the number of people who are displaced is increasing as well.
Over the weekend, Israel turned Rafah into hell on earth. Those are the words of the United Nations.
The UNRWA made a special statement about that particular issue and said on that statement that Gaza is hell on earth, and that the images that were coming from the incident last night were yet another testament to that.
Imran Khan, one of Al Jazeera's senior correspondents, has been covering this latest escalation from Amman, Jordan.
I'm reporting from Amman currently because Benjamin Netanyahu's government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting from the territory of Israel.
Still, Imran's been watching Israel's statements on their rationale for the recent attacks and their reaction. Initially, Imran says, the Israelis were very clear in what they say happened.
They say they struck a Hamas, what they're calling a Hamas compound, in the Tel Sultan area of northwest Rafah, where they say senior officials in Hamas were gathered. But we don't know who was actually there.
Israel says it killed 2 senior Hamas commanders in that attack, but says that the details of the strike are still under investigation.
But as that attack happened, it spread to tents holding displaced people in Rafah. We're hearing at least 45 people have been killed. And this was now then described as a mass casualty event. The Israelis then said that they would investigate the attack. And then they did investigate. There was a preliminary investigation that took place. And it said that a fire spread to a camp. And the Israeli army said they regretted any civilian life being lost in war. Israel's top military prosecutor actually called the situation very grave.
Naturally, in a war of such scope and intensity, difficult events also happen. Some incidents, like last night's incident in Rafah, are very grave. The details of yesterday's incident are still under an investigation, which we are committed to conducting to the fullest extent.
But what's really interesting about this is the acknowledgement that Palestinian civilians were killed. I think there was no other way of spinning this for the Israeli army. They just had to come straight out and say, yes, Palestinian civilians were killed.
Following that, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had another response. He explained that what happened was a, quote, tragic incident caused by a, quote, technical mistake.
Despite our utmost effort not to harm non-combatants, something unfortunately went tragically wrong. We are investigating the incident and will reach conclusions because this is our policy.
This attack, which resulted in one of the deadliest days of the war for Palestinians, comes after a ruling on Friday by the International Court of Justice. The ICJ ordered Israel to stop its offensive on Rafah.
Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
For Imran, the meaning of that order was clear.
That Israel had to cease all military activity in the Rafah area, and there was no ifs, buts, or maybes. However, that's not what Israel's national security advisor has actually been going on talk shows and speaking about. The national security advisor's understanding of the ruling is we shouldn't commit a genocide in Rafah. We haven't committed any genocide so far, and we won't commit any genocide. And therefore, the Rafah operation still can go ahead. There seems to be a huge disconnect between how the Israelis are reading the ICJ ruling and how the rest of the world seems to be, reading that same ruling. And given that the Americans are backing Israel to its fullest extent with money and weapons, despite public statements from the Americans saying, no, you can't go into Rafah with mass ground troops, all of this sort of stuff.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem.
The Rafah attack is still happening. This isn't now a question of, it's when will it happen? It's ongoing. And it is brutal, as we just saw from that latest attack.
And again, because of this latest attack, this idea of safe zones is being called into question now, too.
The idea of safe zones really does come from the American-Israeli axis. They keep talking that Rafah was supposed to be a safe zone. They talked about this 6 months ago. They talked about it kind of almost post-October the 7th when they had a plan to go into Gaza. Everybody else, Palestinians, Palestinian civilians, the health ministry, human rights groups, you name it, realized very quickly that there are no safe zones in Gaza. People were just being pushed firstly from the north down into central Gaza, then from central Gaza into the south. And, people have been displaced not once, not twice, but 3 times now. And now with Rafah going on, people are being, the ones that can get out will be displaced for like a 4th time.
These are displaced people, women and children, who have been living in these makeshift tents for months now.
It may have been for a little while, but the Israeli military plan was always to go into Rafah, where they say the last battalions of Hamas fighters are stationed, and that is the final battle Israel hopes against Hamas. And it may well be the final battle of this particular war.
More after the break. In the past few days, aid trucks have started entering Gaza again after the 2 crossing points had been effectively sealed for weeks. It's been close to impossible to get food and other aid to the people who need it.
I mean, the idea that, you can't get aid into Gaza is ridiculous. There are 2 key crossings here. There's Rafah, which is controlled by Egypt on the Egypt side, and then there's Karam Abu Salim, which is controlled by Israel on the Israeli side. You can just open them up. You can put trucks through there at the rate of 500-600. You could probably get it up to 1,000 a day if you really have the political will to be able to do so. But Egypt is incredibly frustrated. Remember, there are several agreements, the Philadelphia Agreement, there's the Camp David Accords, that basically decided who was going to control the Rafah border crossing. Now, the Rafah border crossing must be a demilitarized zone, and the crossing on the Palestinian side must be controlled by Palestinians. There's a war going on. Rafah's not demilitarized. It broke the agreement, and the Egyptians, and I'm going to put this in the bluntest terms possible, basically said, okay, well, this is now Israel's problem. We aren't going to open up Rafah unilaterally. This has to come as part of an agreement. Then, at the time of recording this, the Americans put pressure on Egypt to open up the Rafah border crossing.
Ultimately, it's a question for Israel. Israel has seized that crossing, and Israel is in control of it now. So it is the responsibility to open that crossing and make sure that it is running effectively. Right now is a responsibility of the government of Israel, which is why we have made clear to them that they need to open the crossing as soon as possible and make sure that aid deliveries can come in, make sure that humanitarian aid workers can come in and come out, and make sure that the delivery of humanitarian assistance isn't further impeded.
And it came as a result of the ICJ ruling, the key part of which was Rafah must be open for humanitarian aid. Egypt was looking into agreeing to that. Oil indications they had actually agreed to that. And then these attacks came, and now we're even hearing of cross-border fire from the Egyptian side on Israeli forces and Israeli forces onto Egyptian forces on the Egyptian side.
An Egyptian soldier has been killed in an exchange of fire with Israeli forces. Shots were fired from both sides along the Rafah crossing with Egypt and Gaza. Israel seized control, of course, of the Palestinian side earlier this month when it began its ground assault of Rafah.
It doesn't give you any hope that Rafah will be opened at any time soon. And instead, they're trying to do these airdrops, which we've seen don't work.
A U.S. military-built temporary floating pier. Now, trucks with the aid rolled across the pier for the first time into the besieged enclave.
This floating pier, they spent $320 million or so on, the Americans did, which has broken effectively in 2. Half of it's kind of floating in the sea and the other half is kind of washed up on shore. And to make matters worse, the Americans are still withdrawing funding to the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, and their funding a year is about the same cost as that pier. So you're not getting in the aid, you can't get an agreement with Egypt to be able to do the aid, The Israelis are breaking previous agreements, and so the whole thing is just tragic.
So, after so much impunity, we asked Imran what the chances are that there will be any accountability for Israel's actions.
I mean, accountability is a big word for the Israelis. No Israeli soldier serving, Israeli soldier or former Israeli soldier, seems to be convicted or even tried for any kind of crime committed against Palestinian civilians. This is almost a key tenet of the Israeli army, that they will never ever do that. The key example for this is, the killing of our own colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed a couple of years ago. No one's ever been convicted for her death. And this is despite the fact that she's an American citizen. There are countless examples of the Israeli army acting without any serious accountability. No one would serve in the Israeli military if soldiers were getting convicted left, right, and center.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by David Enders and Khalid Sultan, with Manahil Naveed, Noor Wazwaz, Sonia Bagant, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Amy Walters. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Nay Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.